Hello, everybody. Welcome to Unit 3, Day 7. And today we're going to be talking about the creation of a new government here in the colonies and what exactly that would look like. Where we left off with the Revolutionary War last, we were talking about that now that we had a country, that the real test of that was going to be starting a country, because you're going to see that throughout history, when new countries get started, it's usually kind of rough as far as creating a new government and then kind of sustaining that new government. So today we're going to talk about creating the Republican institutions that would become our government. So I start here, have you look at a clip from the LA riots and talk a little bit about the LA riots. And it's not in respect to like what the LA riots were about or anything like that, but we're talking about in a situation like this, how do you expect the federal government to respond in these situations? So I encourage you just to take a second and kind of think about that, how you would see the government responding in those situations. Because this is going to be a key question in early America when you're going to see that you actually have rioting take place here in the country. And the question is, how is the government going to respond to that? So when I have you start out today, create your own government, come up with the structure that you think would work best and answer some of these questions. And then now we're going to dive into talking about what the new government actually looked like. So some questions of a new nation. Where would power reside? If you remember, the colonies, again, were very skeptical of a central government, and that's why it took so long for the colonies to actually work together, is because they were very skeptical of putting too much power in a federal government. A lot of the colonies wanted to keep power within themselves. And remember, people still had this attitude of, I'm not an American, I'm a Virginian first, then an American. I'm a New Yorker first, then an American. So question, where would power reside? Who would control the new government? Would the elites control it, or would average citizens have control of the government? What is the role of women? How many rights should women have within this new government? If you remember, at this point in history, again, they were not as advanced as we are. So that was a serious question. Like, were women going to have a role? Would that even be brought up, the role of women within government? The rights of slaves. First of all, what about slavery? Will anything be done to change slavery? And what rights do slaves have within this new nation? How much democracy? That is a good question. Is there such thing as too much democracy? And what should democracy look like? So that was another question that they had. So John Adams here famously said, remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. And this was a key thing that the founding fathers were actually pretty worried about. If you look at Rome, how Rome, probably the first modern democracy, how Rome would fall spectacularly over time as it moved into an empire, and then the government quickly went far away from the democratic principles. And that was a concern of our founding fathers, is how long could our country actually sustain democracy and the republic that we had created? And again, the question is, should government power remain in the hands of the educated, the wealthy, or the average citizen? They're going to say there's a lot of fear about ordinary citizens being in power, maybe people that are uneducated about all the policies and all the ins and outs of government. So these were all legitimate questions they had. And I know that you kind of hear that today and you pause and think, well, why wouldn't they want ordinary people to be in power? But again, big concern from them about this and what exactly this would look like for them. So thoughts on government. John Adams wrote this, and in this, he applied the theory of mixed government to Republican government. And in it, he came up with some principles that you're going to see are going to become part of our eventual government. One, he said there should be, in theory, three roles of government. We would call these the branches, but three roles of government. There should be a legislature to make law, an executive to administer the law, and the judiciary to enforce the law. Now, when we actually create our laws, our government under the Constitution, we would change those a little bit, but still you got the general principle there. He also believed in a bicameral legislature. For him, he said we should have an upper house that would be property owners, and the lower house would be the one that would be kind of the ordinary people, the popular majorities would be that one. Next up, elected governor with veto power over laws. Of course, that would become a president under our system of the Constitution, and an appointed judiciary, which again would become part of our system under the U.S. Constitution. So starting on the state level, you're going to see that by 1777, 10 of the former colonies had written new constitutions, including Virginia. And you're going to see that almost or every one of these governments would be based on popular sovereignty and the idea that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. You can see some examples here in the North Carolina Constitution. It says, oppose everything that leans into aristocracy or power in the hands of rich and chief men, exercise the opposition of the poor. And you even see in Pennsylvania, they would go as far to abolish property ownership as a test of citizenship and granted taxpaying men the right to vote. So again, you're going to see that all the colonies are kind of grappling with how to do this new government on their own. And eventually what would become our federal government is going to take a lot of these principles from the state government. So similarities in state constitutions. You're going to see that each state began with some sort of bill listing out basic rights and freedoms. Almost all the states had separation of power into 3 branches. Voting, all white males that owned property could vote. And the reason that they did this property requirement was based on the assumption that property owners had a larger stake in government than the poor and the propertyless. And again, that was a valid concern of theirs, that if people didn't own property and didn't really have a stake in this new country, that they would be more affected by the whims of, politicians and that kind of thing. So that's why at the beginning they set this up so that property owners were the ones that were doing the voting. And office holding, again, usually required property ownership, but more than the average voter would have to own. But you're going to see that pretty much all the states have these similarities in common as far as their state constitutions. Now, rights of women, you're going to see in this time, again, where we are in history at this time, that women aren't pushing for civic equality with men, but they want an end to certain restrictive customs and laws during this time. I've mentioned before Abigail Adams and the influence that she had in our founding fathers and in her own husband. She demanded equal rights for married women, because at this time, depending on where you were, most married women could not own property, enter into contracts, or initiate lawsuits. That was something that was left up to their men to do. And probably the most famous of the people that pushed for women's rights during this time, there's a picture of her there, Judith Sargent Murray. She wrote on the equality of the sexes, and she basically said that men and women were equal, and that in some respects that women were better to men, saying that they had superior imaginations. But she said the reason that men during that time had such a prevalent role like they did is because they were given more training in judgment and reasoning and that kind of thing because of their education, which wasn't given to women at the time, which is a valid point that she is making, that they weren't given equality of opportunity during that time. So she said that's why it appeared that men were better in some respects than women as far as reasoning and politics and all of that. You're going to see, again, largely these requests were ignored. And again, that's not just an American thing, that's a world thing at the time, with patriarchs and men still usually dominating the household. You will see in the 1790s that in Massachusetts, the attorney general there would declare that women had the equal right to schooling. And again, you're going to see that change typically happen in the New England colonies and then kind of trickle down to the rest of the colonies. And with that, you're going to see that women do now having that access to being able to read and access to education and all that would work out well for them. So loyalists, this is another question as far as what to do with loyalists in the colony. You're going to see that you have 100,000 loyalists that actually flee America, but then they get to America and realize that they're kind of like aliens in England because, again, they had been colonists. And remember, we talked about when the colonists and the British interacted with each other, a lot of times the British looked down on the colonists. So a lot of them, it was a struggle when they did go back to England. Again, you did have some patriots that seized loyalist property, and usually they didn't seize it all. They did take some of it. And if you remember the treaties that were set up at the end of the American Revolution was that patriots would return any of that seized property to the loyalists. And you're going to see that in the cities, that these traditional economic elite that you had there, a lot of them that were loyalists and did side with the British, were replaced with entrepreneurs who promoted trade and domestic manufacturing. So 1777, that brings us to Articles of Confederation, and you're going to see that the first government was created during the American Revolution, and it created a loose confederation of states, and it even said in there, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. So basically, what you're going to see with the Articles of Confederation is that it was set up to do what it needed to do at the time, which was to make war and peace, treaties, deal with financial issues and that kind of stuff. Basically, it was like a wartime government is what it had been set up to do. And you can read the powers there. Again, very, very limited in power, still heavily dependent upon the states and kind of the whims of the states and what they wanted to do during that time. The organization of the Articles of Confederation, it had a unicameral legislature, the Congress. Every state had one vote. 9 of 13 states had to approve of any important laws. If there were going to be any changes to it, like any amendments, every state had to agree to that. There were no separative executive or judicial branches. Everything was within that one central unicameral legislature. And you're going to see by 1790-81 that all states had ratified the Articles, partly because Western land disputes had been an issue, and so they wanted to quickly push this along, and you'll see what comes out of that. Now, there are several things with this organization that are going to be an issue. One, the idea that each state had one vote. This was a problem, especially the big states had an issue with this because you're telling me like Virginia at this time, which would have been your most populous state, Virginia and New York would have been your most populous states, and Rhode Island has the same vote as them. And a lot of the bigger states looked at that and said, that's not right. We have a lot more representatives. We should have more say than them. Also, the other big issue is that all the states have to give consent to change the Articles of Confederation. I always tell my classes, if I were to walk into this room with chocolate chip cookies for everyone, there would inevitably be at least one person that says, I don't like chocolate chip cookies. And the point I'm trying to make with that is it's hard to get everybody to agree on something. You're usually going to have at least one person, no matter how good something is, at least one person is going to have something to complain about. And that was an issue with the Articles there. There's a reading there for you to do about the Shays Rebellion, and that is going to lead us into some of the problems here of the Articles of Confederation. So, for one, Articles lacked ability to tax the states or to establish a common currency. So the issue that you had is a lot of the states printed their own money and did their own thing during that. Because of that, it led to a lot of financial instability on a whole as a nation. You will see that during the Revolutionary War, Robert Morris set up the Bank of North America, which created a financial system to handle a lot of the war expenditures and centralize the foreign debt. He had hoped that creating a national debt would create a desire for import duties to help pay that off. But you're going to see that some states did reject that. But again, under the Articles, you're going to see that the colonies during the Revolutionary War and then the beginning of our country financially not in great shape as a result of that. You will see, I did mention land earlier, that Congress did look to sell some Western lands to help raise revenue during and after the war. They did seek payment from squatters who had moved out there and were living on the land. These people were known as white savages. And you actually see in Tennessee, in eastern Tennessee, they tried to organize their own state known as the state of Franklin and get admission to the Articles of Confederation. Congress would refuse that, though, and actually give that to Virginia to take care of. But this whole state of Franklin, that's kind of like a historical oddity you have to check out. Very interesting how they set up their own territory there. Kind of that becomes the precursor to what would later become the state of Tennessee. You will see that it does create the Southwest Territory, which included Alabama and Mississippi, which slavery was allowed in this state. Now, the big thing that you're going to see the Articles of Confederation did well was dealing with the Northwest Territory. Now, when we think of the Northwest Territory, Northwest today, we think of like Washington and Oregon and that area. But during this time, the Northwest was the area of like Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, the area that's in green there on that map. So in 1784, you would have the Northwest Ordinance written by Thomas Jefferson, and it said that the Northwest Territory could become states when the population equaled that of the smallest state of the time. They set up the Land Ordinance of 1785, which created a rectangular grid system for the Northwest there. and encourage large land purchase. Basically, it surveyed it into squares and encouraged people to buy this land, which again would benefit the people that had money to buy the land, which is usually the wealthy. This is interesting. My wife is from Michigan, and if you look at a lot of the Midwest and how the states there are set up, they are still very much set up in these grid patterns, especially when you look at the roads. It always baffles her family when they come down here from Michigan, because the roads here are very curvy, because a lot of our roads follow old farm roads, old Indian trails, and that kind of thing. And you go up there and you will notice that pretty much all their roads are laid out in some sort of square pattern. And a lot of it goes back to this land ordinance of 1785. And then finally, you're going to have the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which created the territories that would become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Another big thing that it did was prohibited slavery in those territories and earmarked funds for education. And again, this is a big deal. These Northwest ordinances that were passed basically set up the guidelines of how a territory could become a state, which would apply to the future. And the whole idea that these places banned slavery, another big deal. And it's amazing when you look at it and think of it, like, how did they get that through at that time? Because we're going to see later, whenever the U.S. Gets new territory, that the whole issue of slavery is going to be a massive issue. But at this time, they were able to get this through and make sure that these territories did not engage in slavery. And later on, Jefferson would even comment and about how this almost led to a division of the country between the slave owners and non-slave owners, which would then later lead to the Civil War. But it is interesting that happened during this time. And again, I already mentioned that we just talked about this here, about what the Northwest Ordinance looked like. And again, the whole idea of voting rights: if you owned 50 acres, you could vote. You had to own more land if you had hoped to hold government office. So, and I mentioned there at the bottom, the South agreed to not allowing slavery in those areas because slavery was extended into Kentucky and Tennessee. And basically, some Southerners viewed as not having slavery in these Northwest territories would eliminate a possible source of competition to them. So build up to Shays' Rebellion. As I said, financially, government not in good shape. In the eastern part of the country, they were going through an economic recession, partly due to some of the things the British had done to us after the war, not allowing us to trade with the West Indies. Also, you're going to see the British were still able to undercut our businesses here as far as prices, which hurt them as well. State governments were struggling due to the large war debts that they had in place. So all of this is going to lead, again, to Shays' Rebellion. Now, farmers and artisans, you're going to see they had a lot of control in many of the lower houses in the North and made up a very big minority within the South. And if you've ever wondered when you go to another state, you're like, why isn't New York City the capital of New York? A lot of that goes back to this time when the farmers and artisans were in control. They wanted the capitals moved away from the East Coast areas that they had been in and moved farther inland where you had more of the farmers at. So you see Pennsylvania there. Philadelphia, the capital was moved to Harrisburg. South Carolina, the capital was moved from Charleston to Columbia. And again, a lot of that was to wrestle control out of who the farmers' artisans saw as this Eastern elite over there. So Shays' Rebellion. So one of the things that was happening in this time, again, you had a lot of farmers in Massachusetts that were losing their farms. Some states enacted debtor relief legislation to try to help out farmers so that farmers would not lose their farm. Massachusetts is one of the states that does not do that. And you're going to see because of that, you're going to have farmers who are threatened with lawsuits when they're unable to pay their debt. And a lot of times they would actually be thrown in debtor prison. They would lose their land and that kind of stuff. A lot of people very, very much resented that. And again, it was seen as this elite really sticking it to the farmers and the artisans during this time. So you're going to see that mobs of farmers led by Daniel Shay, who had been a Revolutionary War veteran, they began to march on the courts and close the courts by force. And again, he kind of jumps in to lead this push there. There is a video here for you to watch of the causes of this. And a lot of people view Shays' Rebellion as a second revolution. Members within Shays' army would actually place pine twigs in their hats, just as troops had done during the American Revolution. You actually see the pine tree flag during the American Revolution that says an appeal to heaven. Again, that whole idea of going back to the pine tree. Massachusetts would pass a riot act outlawing illegal assemblies, and Sam Adams would actually speak out against the Shays'ites, which is funny because if you remember, he's the one that had really pushed the conflict with Britain before the Revolutionary War got started. And you're going to see that the governor of Massachusetts would eventually assemble his own fighting force, mostly with his own money, which quickly put down Shays' army at that time. Plus that, and there was a really bad winter as well that just affected the whole thing. Now, the question that this raises with Shays' rebellion is it showed the weakness of the federal government, because in this, the federal government didn't really have any powers to do anything. The federal government could not come into the state of Massachusetts and put it down. And Henry Knox would argue that this was one of the strongest arguments possible that a strong national government was needed because the federal government couldn't do anything about it. And you're going to see that angry farmers in other states also start to demand economic relief as well. So Thomas Jefferson famously wrote about Shays' rebellion. At this time, Thomas Jefferson was over in Paris, and he would write about this, and he would say the famous line here. He said, "I hold to it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical." And basically, the reason that he said this was he believed that rebellions were a way of keeping government in check. And then later on, also talking about Shays' rebellion, he said, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is a natural manure." And again, this is a younger Thomas Jefferson talking. You're going to see much later in his life that he's going to have some different views on this kind of thing and see the necessity of the country being united. But early on, he saw this as good because he saw it as a way of keeping the government in check. So, as we have talked about, problems with the Articles of Confederation, only one branch of government, very limited in their lawmaking ability. There was no common currency, each state only having one vote, and there was a lack of national sovereignty as well. After the Revolutionary War, the British would actually leave forts here. In the Western frontier, you'd also have the Spanish restricting navigation on the Mississippi River as well. So we're really, even though we're a country, we didn't have that national sovereignty you need to operate as a nation. So what did the Articles do good? One, led us through the Revolutionary War, helped us to win the Revolutionary War. The land ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance that we talked about, which basically came up with how territories could become states, outlawed slavery in the Northwest Territory and do all that. It also did that as well. So I've seen some AP U.S. history exam questions before about the Articles and what the Articles did well. You could list these. Another thing that they really like to do in the AP exam is compare the Articles and the Constitution and basically contrast the two of them. So we'll be talking about the Constitution next class, and just keep in mind the differences between those two and how they can be contrasted. So last thing that you're going to do today is write an obituary for the Articles of Confederation, explain the birth of the Articles, its life and death. I put a sample obituary on there. You can choose, though, if you want to do a video tribute to the Articles instead of writing an obituary. Just make sure that you include those. And also an obituary usually has a picture with it, so you can come up with a picture too. So again, today, Articles of Confederation, it did its job when it needed to, but it became very clear that we were going to have to move in a different direction of the country, and that will take us to next class and to the creation of the U.S. Constitution. Hope you all have a great day.